Weapons of mass communication: stories, metaphors, and questions. What is the one message the world needs to hear right now? How do we get the information and ideas from our minds into others? So a few notes before we begin. So let's acknowledge ourselves for still functioning in this craziness. The fact that we're still looking for solutions and we're still functioning is a good sign. Obviously, the heat is being turned up now to anyone that's in any of the minorities. There's limited resources, so we're looking to get substance over style, so not so many bells and whistles, and the real key information out to people. We give an analogy of the apple juice. So it's like when you grab an apple juice from the supermarket and there's all these little bits. As we learn new information, it's like the apple juice is being shaken up. Everything seems very confusing, cloudy. But as you just sit down later this evening, it will start to settle and you'll start to remember. And obviously, because we're recording it, you can watch again. So really the advice is just to relax, absorb as much as you can. It's been my experience that when I watch things like this, I have to watch them 3 or 4 times before they really land. And to avoid censorship, we have made a few adjustments by either being abstract or using substitute words. There's no use getting information out there if it doesn't reach anyone. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to quickly show 2 minutes of a video that's really key. And it's on the subject of the curse of knowledge. Make sure we have enough sound.
Your friend for dinner. Halfway through dinner, you tell your friend that you want to try an experiment. You tell them that you're going to spend 10 seconds tapping out a famous song on the table, and they have to guess what that song is. You start by tapping out the rhythm to the song, Happy Birthday. If you did that experiment with 10 friends, how many of those friends do you think would guess the song? 1 out of 10 friends or 5 out of 10 friends? In 1990, psychologist Elizabeth Newton played this game with students at Stanford University. Her findings were startling. Only 1 in 40 students could guess the famous song that the tapper was tapping. But here's the troubling thing. The people who were tapping out the songs thought that at least half the people would guess the song that they're tapping. Because the tappers knew the song and they had the song playing in their head, they expected many more people to understand what song they were trying to communicate. This is what psychologists call the curse of knowledge. Most of the time, we communicate our ideas as if we are the audience, and we forget that the audience doesn't share our knowledge. This makes our communication either confusing or boring. The curse of knowledge is the reason why brilliant scientists write papers that almost no one else can understand, because hardly anyone else shares their same level of knowledge. The curse of knowledge is the reason you can give a colleague straightforward instructions, but those instructions seem confusing to that person. The curse of knowledge is the reason you can spend hours putting together a presentation that you find interesting, but everyone that you present it to seems bored and distracted. If you can't communicate your ideas effectively, you waste a huge amount of time and effort developing those ideas. Luckily.
So this was a very interesting experiment, and it really shows why there's so much information out there. There's so many solutions to the problems that we're facing. But the fact is the scientists, etc., have been unable to get those ideas simply into people's minds. So that's really what we're looking at. How do we do that? And obviously the media understands that crystal clear, which is why they take very complex ideas and make them very, very simple for people to understand. And obviously not always correct information. So on this note, I'm going to show the next slide, which is an incredibly brilliant idea and very fundamental to a lot of science, but is conveyed in a way that probably no one would understand initially. I certainly couldn't myself. So I'll just show you for illustration purposes. And those of you that work in science or doctors may well understand it. But Karl Popper was a professor of logic. And he said, my proposal is based upon an asymmetry between verifiability and falsifiability, an asymmetry which results from the logical form of universal statements. For these are never derivable from singular statements, but can be contradicted by singular statements. Okay. This, to the average member of the public, would seem to be in a different language. But in fact, it's actually relatively straightforward. And at the top, it says black swans count. So what Carl was Popper was pointing out is that you only need to see one black swan to know that all swans are not white. That's really the exceptions to the rules are key. And obviously, when you look at science and you look at history, so things like, let's say we had censorship in the 70s, we would still be living in asbestos houses, driving leaded petrol, with kids smoking cigarettes. Because on each of those things, it was a small minority of people that pointed out that the theories were not true, that those things were safe. Now, how do we get that rather complex idea into a simple form? And it's really just by selling a simple story. So we come up with a simple story, which was the squirrels in the park. So let's say I have a scientific theory that there's no squirrels in my local park. Okay, that's my theory. In order to prove my theory, I send 100 people to the park to spend the weekend, and they all have cameras. Then Monday morning, they come back, and I'm assuming that I can trust all 100 people. That's a given. And then they come back, but 2 people had pictures of squirrels. Okay, are there squirrels in the park? Yes, but 98% of people found no squirrels. 98% of people agreed with my theory. Now, putting aside the psychological effect on, if people look at your theory and they think it's true, they're obviously going to do all behaviors to try and back that up. When really the thing that we should be doing is trying to prove the theory to be false. And that's what the sort of black swan is. So once you have a black swan, you now know that, swans can be other than white. So the question is, how many masterpieces, golden ideas are sitting inside your minds? How many ideas are very key to get into someone else's mind? And you won't be able to get that into someone else's mind by giving them a conclusion. Hardly at all that works. So here's another important question. What is our most precious commodity? And I think you'll find that it's actually our attention. So the yellow box actually represents our attention. So what you're finding is very common at the moment is a lot of people, when they start to realize something's not quite right, they tend to say, well, what can I do? What difference can I make? Not realizing a huge difference. This is really a form of learned helplessness, where we realize it's when someone loses control over their environment and they tend to think, well, there's nothing I can do. And it's very problematic. It's one of the biggest things we have to address. So really, where someone's attention is very key. So we could ask the question, well, you are or can be very, very important to everything. In fact, you're very key to those around you. I think we often focus on our failure to reach people without realizing how many people we probably have reached, how many people we've affected, and this constantly happens. And due to many psychological factors, we often dismiss the ones that succeed, and we don't realize because, it's so analog. But there's a very important story around the starfish. So there was a young boy walking down a beach, and thousands of starfish had been washed up through a storm, and they're all going to perish if they were on the beach. Anyway, the young boy is picking them up one by one and walking them back into the water. Along comes an adult and asks the child what he's doing. And he says, well, I'm putting the starfish back in the water. And then the adult says, but there's thousands of them. It makes no difference. And he says, but it does to this one. And that's what we realize. Any one of us is not going to change 100 million people, but we don't have to. We only have to change the few people around us. They will change the few people around them. And a number that doubles every day, I do believe that in 30 days, it's 600 million. So a lot of people focus on trying to eat an elephant, but that's really not the job. You just do it one bite at a time. And of course, that's really when our focus is there, and just to keep going, keep going, keep going. And always to realize that the game can change at any moment. And in fact, the game is starting to change really profoundly now that the house of cards is under so much attack from so many facts that we really only get to start pointing a few of them out, because it's the tipping point will be reached. So effectively, what we're pointing out here is that once you see the gorilla, you can't unsee the gorilla. So for those of you that've seen the selective attention test, once you've seen it, you can't unsee it. So we're going to look at today how to bring the gorilla into people's awareness, because you can't point at the gorilla and say, there's a gorilla. You've effectively got to do it in many other more powerful ways. So one of the first stories that really struck me that was quite interesting, that I've fortunate enough trained some really sort of world-class poker players in my time and coached them. So in the sort of poker community with some friends, there's sometimes some respect, and funny enough, the professor was the name that I was given. And there was one particular young poker player who's very, very intelligent. And on my Facebook, we got into this debate around face nappies, and he posted this on to one of my posts. And this is a metaphor that doesn't really is not based on science, but it's actually became a very key metaphor for a lot of people's thoughts. So once they understood the metaphor, they then processed it. So effectively, the metaphor is, at the top part, is saying that if two people were standing there naked and one person started to urinate, then the other person would get wet. Obviously, it's quite crass. But then they said, well, if you wore trousers, you would get less wet. But if you both wore trousers, none of you would get wet. And this was the justification. Now, I said to him, well, what happens if someone farts? Because that's effectively, and then that sort of shifted. And the interesting thing about the story is that I didn't see him for a few months. And then I bumped into him somewhere, and he came up to me and he said, oh my God, you were right. It's none of it's true. These things are not true. This is not happening. And I said, oh, hang on a minute. What did it for you? I wanted to know, what was it? He said, well, I don't know. I was going through loads of your posts, and then it suddenly struck me. And what was important about that is that a lot of the time, you're not going to know what the straw that broke the camel's back was. But in fact, for me, the key is to just keep introducing information into someone's awareness. And at some point, that information will be digested and their opinion will shift. Perception is largely based on our experiences. Well, pretty much always, in fact. So then we have some important questions, which are, and of course, once Kay saw the gorilla, he couldn't unsee it. So for him now, that's it, he's aware. And then he was saying to me, but all my friends can't see it. And I was saying, yeah, well, that's the interesting part, because he then went about trying to tell them. And as we see, you can't tell, you have to show. The very subtle way of understanding this. So if we look at our goals around messaging, so really we've got those pushing the same way, need clear messaging on solutions, action, ways to collaborate, and conflict resolution. When you look at so many of the groups that are trying to do positive things, a lot of them are fracturing. We've effectively got the perfect storm for conflict. And obviously lots of information is being shared. We also make the assumption that when we're in the same group that we share all the same beliefs, and that's not true. There's many subtle, sub-beliefs that we don't share, but we really need to focus on, what the common ground is and really know what it is our outcome. Obviously, those on the fence require information and then the above. And those buying a false narrative need the false assumptions highlighted and reversed. But we also don't really need to focus on those people that are, sort of rabidly bought into everything, because in fact, it's like a seesaw. So you have two ends of the seesaw, which are the people that, truly believe something very strongly. And then it's those in the middle that's the key. Whichever way they go will tip the seesaw, and those at the other end will have no chance but to follow, because that's how it happens in kind of democracies, for rightly or wrongly. So, and also those speaking up need protection from the trolls and the problematic objectors. So a lot of people, have spoken up and then have stayed silent because they've received a lot of blowback. But when they get support, and this has started to shift, so a few of the famous footballers, etc., have spoken up and they've got a lot of support. And that's really allowed them and given them the fuel to continue doing what they're doing. Because when you speak up against a narrative, it is not pleasant. You will get a lot of blowback because, if you want to upset someone, you tell them a lie. But if you really want to upset them, you tell them the truth. So that's where we are. So today we're going to look at what we call weapons of mass communication, really for using a metaphor, which are stories, metaphors, and questions. So they're the three pillars. So we could effectively say you want to smack people with the truth. So but you want to smack them in a way that won't have it bounce off. Now, in order for us to really have the stories, metaphors, and questions work. It's very useful to have a basic knowledge of perception, which we're going to look at today. How much of a basic knowledge? Just enough paint to do the job, okay? So one of the funny stories that I like to tell, really to display something that's going on, is that there was a discovery in a far, far away land. And that discovery was that 2 + 2 actually equals 5. So all the governments started to relay this. Excuse me. The World Health Foundation decided to take it upon themselves to, fund lots of the media to get this out. They had teams of psychologists working out how to present the information. Then we had the trusted experts, a little goblin, a software engineer, and an actor as the face of the story. But then some people turned around and said, but hang on, 2 + 2 equals 4. But then the people replied, are you anti-5? You must be a conspiracy theorist. And here really lies the problem, is that when someone thinks that 2 + 2 equals 5, the real focus is on the equals. But in fact, by trying to tell someone that it equals 4, all you're doing is conclusions matching conclusions. And this is why Max Planck said that, science moves on one funeral at a time, because in fact, they tend to discuss the conclusion of theories rather than work through the theories themselves. So the question really is, what's in the equals? And of course, nothing is so, but thinking makes it so. And with the technology we have nowadays, and that quote was by Shakespeare. But if you think about historically, people would learn through experience, but in fact, most people learn now via stories. So in fact, they're processing the information that they're given and making various conclusions, which is why if they're given false assumptions through stories, they will come to faulty conclusions. But they will be absolutely solid, or most people will, that those conclusions are true. We also do not like having our conclusions challenged because it's very threatening to our ego and our world, and it almost feels like, a fight or flight, like we're being attacked by a tiger. So how do people make sense of it? It comes back to the yellow box. Where is our focus? If we focus only on the 5 and the 4, then all we're going to do is stand there all day, chatting back and forth about our conclusions. But if we focus on the equals, we start to understand what are the false assumptions that someone believes in order to get to 5, then we can start to challenge those and challenge them very effectively with stories, metaphors, and questions. The equal is each person's perception. Everyone has a unique perception, but if people are watching the same media, they will share commonalities. So really the question is the domino or the straw. And what we mean by this is that it's really the first domino that gets knocked, where people start to question things. But I think everyone's had the first domino knocked. The question now is, what is the straw that's going to break the camel's back? What is the bits of information that are going to get people to question? And I've certainly seen in other groups where people have said they've had friends that were totally bought into all the narrative, have now realized that they were played, basically. So I think we're going to see a tipping point approaching soon. So really, when we start to think about this now in the equals, what are the foundations of perceptions? So really, simplistically to describe it, it's the map is not the territory. What we mean by this is we can never really interact with reality. We can only interact with our map of reality, how we think things are. And that's the key point, think. Then there's this gap. And this gap is, bigger for some more than others. You can never close the gap completely, but you want the map reflecting reality as closely as it can. Maps are not right or wrong. Maps are only useful or not useful. And obviously, we've all been in a car where the GPS takes us to a completely random location from the one we put in. Obviously, that was not useful. Now, there's one caveat I'd like to bring in, which is emotions play a major part in this. We're not going to look into it in detail today because it's a very big subject, but emotions will distort reality greatly. So if you can get someone to fear something, that fear will give a very different weighting to a subject than that weighting should have. And this can be quite clearly seen in today's world, where some people fear some diseases much more than other diseases where they would have much more chance of succumbing to. So there's a real imbalance. Emotions will really imbalance things. And behavior is driven primarily by the perception of the unconscious mind. And on the course, we show the analogy of the horse and the rider. It doesn't really matter what the rider thinks. The horse has the last say. And this is why I was talking to someone on Saturday who had a spider phobia. in England, and they know that spider phobia is in no way rational. They know that, they're very intelligent, but that doesn't stop them being scared of the spider. So that's the real key part, is that the unconscious mind, this horse, is a thing that's being trained. And this is why the metaphors, stories, and questions can really get to talk to the horse directly, because the conscious mind, where we think we're in control, the truth is only, a short time. So really the question is, do we need something new in the map, or do we need something in the map altered? So really, are we changing something, or are we entering something new? And of course, there's lots of examples where, you can bring something in new very simply by just asking a question. So just quickly, let's touch on why is that gap so large for so many people? And if you, and this is kind of key, because it's so common for people to look at someone that buys into a certain narrative and to call them stupid. And it's not really intelligence. There is definitely a role of critical thinking, which to question what we're being told. But there's some very, very intelligent people that believe some myths, and that's always the case. And the reason really is that Joe, if he got all his information from the mainstream media, as Cheryl Atkinson pointed out, the media pretty much now is just an advertising company. It's completely slanted towards certain subjects. Ofcom have actually barred certain information making it into the mainstream. You literally can't say something if it will dissuade someone from getting something. And you can obviously fill in the blanks. The censorship, obviously, if anything disagrees with one organization, the information is deleted. This would be, if we think about the squirrels at the park, this would be deleting the photos of the squirrels. That's effectively what you're doing. You're not having any access to any information that contradicts the theory. And that is obviously in science the most dangerous thing. So the censorship is very dangerous. Astroturfing was coined by Cheryl Atkinson, who the book that she wrote is brilliant. She was an award-winning journalist, 20 years at CBS. And she was pointing out that no longer were journalists being objective, they were basically being slanted towards a narrative which was driven by corporate interests. Now, then you add into this, and what she said also was that the average person is living a Truman-esque reality. They are not aware that the reality that they're living in is actually probably not true. Then you've got the behavioral insights team, teams of psychologists, presenting the data in a specific way to convince people. You've got these nudge continuums, you've got this mind space document, influencing behavior through public policy. The 7 laws of influence was 6, now 7, and much, much more. So effectively, the average member of the public is having his information so distorted to fit a certain narrative. And we saw it the other day that some of the models, the reason for the policy that's occurring at the moment, they were asked to produce the models to fit what they wanted, not the other way around. They didn't decide policy on the models. They actually wanted the models to fit the decided policy. So this is what we're seeing. And the fact that people are becoming aware of that now is very key. So now we've kind of got a basic understanding of perception, the fact that it's all about the map. The fact that Joe's going to have so many pieces of information in his mind that might not be true, we can actually start to analyze and respond. And one of the most common things you'll see is that people will go, you're spreading misinformation. Now, obviously, it's the equivalent of him saying 2 + 2 = 5. To say 2 + 2 = 4 in response will have almost zero effect. So really, there's a couple of ways that you can go with the question. In my initial question, I like to actually ask them to define what they mean. So, all right, that's possible. It's possible I'm spreading misinformation. Which misinformation am I spreading? Then what will happen is this will open up. Joe will suddenly realize that all of the beliefs that he's standing on, which he thought had a lot of deep understanding, actually have probably no understanding. So it's called the illusion of explanatory depth. It's very worth looking into this. It's very, very important. We've gone into it a number of times on these sessions because it's very, very key. Once you ask Joe this question, he's suddenly going to realize this. He's then going to go into cognitive dissonance. At that point, you can be very supportive. But if we start to look at that in more depth, what you'll see is there's going to be a whole bunch, so his equals is going to be a whole bunch of things that might be true or not true. Now, our point is to bring information in, and obviously when we look at the communication styles, is to land the information to bust a bubble. So bursting the bubbles with false assumptions. So any of these things could be challenged. And what you'll find is that when they're challenged successfully, Joe's map is going to continually change. He may reach a point where he realizes he's been played, and then he might feel somewhat, learned helplessness or whatever, but at least he's in a different place and we can then address the next issue. So how can we burst the bubbles? So effectively, this was a very, very powerful quote. You teach me, I forget. You show me, I remember. You involve me, I understand. Obviously, early on the project, we just told people lots of things. People would go, oh yeah, that makes sense. But then they would forget, including myself. When we started to show people, tell them stories, a lot more powerful. Then when we started to do exercises, more powerful so just a couple of miscellaneous points. So it's really feelings over facts. So the tick box in any decision is always a feeling. This has been demonstrated by many neuroscientists that if there's a damage to the emotional part of the brain, the intelligence will stay the same, but the person's life will literally fall apart because they won't know the check into what decision to make. And whenever you're talking to someone, and I had this experience a few weeks ago, I was talking to a very intelligent scientist and he was describing some very complex things, and I could really feel my mind was just trying to grab onto something. It was trying to grab something, meaningful call, trying to make sense of it. And then when I sort of said, oh, can you explain that in a story or a metaphor? That's when it becomes very, very powerful. And it was Einstein that said, if I can't see it, I can't understand it. So with a lot of abstract words and concepts, it takes a long while to really understand them. But when you give a simple metaphor, it can land so quickly. Okay, so let's look at the first and probably the most powerful of the weapons of mass communication, which is stories. So we learn via stories, and we actually build our belief systems and knowledge through them. And there was a very powerful story, funny enough, that I was reading. It was some research done by a psychologist, Luis Fusari, out of Italy. And he showed that children reading specific books affected their belief systems. And he showed an example of that children that read Harry Potter are actually a lot more tolerant to immigrants. So what happens is that people are really just absorbing this, and it's changing their map, but it's changing it so smoothly that we're often not aware. And a lot of us will, when we think back about our lives, there'll be various stories that really play such a major impact on our lives. And of course, then the story that we tell ourselves about how we're living obviously has a huge effect. So it was Plato that said, those who tell the stories rule society. And Jeremy Bruner was a cognitive psychologist in the 60s, and he actually showed that stories are 22 times more memorable than data. So if we put that into a metaphor or a story, let's imagine there's a dartboard. Somebody has just a fact, they have one dart. I have a fact in a story. I would actually have 22 darts, okay? Much more power to hit the target. So this is what's really going on, is that, it's so hard to absorb and process a lot of data that when we start to put them into metaphors and stories, in fact, and when you think about I've watched certain presentations, and the thing is, what is it that you remember? It will usually be a metaphor or story. So I've had to change some of the data in here so we don't get censored, but I think you will work out, certainly you can ask in the Q&A what this is. But basically there is a drug that's out there that can be given to people. And there was a gentleman, 81-year-old John Swanson. He was on a ventilator. The hospital had told his family that he had a couple of days to live. They wanted to give him this drug. The hospital refused the treatment. So the lawyers took it to court and they won. And they was able to administer this drug to John Swanson. So John then, a few days later, recovers, and I think within even a week, he was at home. So this unnamed drug, widely used, decades of safety, $2 per dose, billions administered, suddenly had lots of censorship going on that really makes you ask the question. So cheap drugs are being blocked purely for profit for a more expensive subject. And then complete censorship. So many court cases actually came about from this one court case, and then many news articles. Now, what's very powerful about this story is how many important points are made in this story. So you've got lots of credibility from the lawyers, from doctors, from them winning the court case, the fact that he's at home safe. But when I've told this story to people, as opposed to just told them this drug might be useful, if you tell them this drug might be useful, they just rely on what they already know, which is they're told it doesn't work. When I've told people this story, they usually ask me, oh, where can I get this? They become curious. And that's the power of stories. And of course, just one other point with stories is that we have to, and when we listen to a story, in order to make sense of it, we have to create these pictures, we have to create these representations. So that's going on in the back of our mind. That's why stories are so powerful. And that's why really we should be very careful of the stories we're exposed to and the TV that we watch. So then we've got metaphors. Now, it was Aristotle that said the greatest thing by far is to be a master of metaphor. It is the one thing that cannot be learned from others, and it is also a sign of genius, since a good metaphor implies an intuitive perception of the similarity of the dissimilar. So it's effectively saying, well, it's like this. Now, if this is something that someone knows, the new information can enter the old structure and be digested by the brain and the mind and the body. And that's why they're so, so powerful. And it's been known for thousands of years that they're powerful. So for simplicity of purpose, we'll include the similes and the analogies as metaphors. We're not going to distinguish. So from our perspective, the only level we need to know is that all of these we will look at as metaphors. And of course, there was a very brilliant doctor recently was presenting on Panda, and I watched the presentation, and it was an hour, incredible information, very technical, but brilliant. But then one gentleman stepped in and told us a metaphor of an avalanche. And he said, this is the reason the XXS isn't working, then explained the saying, if you're going to protect yourself from an avalanche, you need to put the barriers up on the mountain. But this thing, we're putting the barriers in the town, so it's not in the right place to protect us, or if it was, to provide any protection. Now, what was interesting, a week later, I couldn't remember anything about the presentation because it was complex, but I remembered the metaphor. I mean, I remembered everything that that gentleman said and the point he made. The other information was really key, but because I couldn't process it or digest it, I wasn't able to keep it. Fortunately, it's recorded, and academic purposes, obviously we can go through it. But this is the thing, when we're presenting such fundamentally powerful information, we've got to be aware of just how much will stick, and that's why we can really package it to stick. So a metaphor states that one thing is another thing. It is like. It equates these two things, not because they're actually the same, but for the sake of comparison or symbolism. And really the origin, it's a Greek word, and it means to carry across. And I think it's very powerful because I think what it does is it carries the information from the conscious mind to the unconscious mind. That's when it really starts to change people's perception, when it makes it into the unconscious mind. The metaphor states one thing is another thing. It is like, and that's really the simple. If you've got some complex information, what you do is you put it in a metaphor. So you've got information plus metaphor equals understanding. It equates these two things, not because they're actually the same, but for the sake of comparison or symbolism. We've only got to look at some of the metaphors that have been used. Circuit breaker, very questionable whether it's based on solid science, but everyone in the UK certainly understood this and used it as a reason for changing their behavior. It was a very, very powerful metaphor because, you explain to people why they need to do something. It didn't make sense. You gave this to them and suddenly it made sense to them. So we've got plenty of examples of metaphors in the project that have been very powerful. At the start, we weren't using them so much, and we would telling people information, but it didn't make much difference. People consciously knew, but it didn't really change behaviors or really have them process it. And then this was a very powerful thing that happened. There's a very good story that we tell about the lady in the park, and we've got it on the website, so you can watch it there. But effectively, when I spoke to the lady that managed to, so she was put in a situation where she was really challenged by someone, and she was getting very angry. And then she remembered this metaphor where I said to her, don't step in the ring. She managed to stop the anger coming up. And we said, don't step in the ring, be in the person's corner. That one metaphor that she remembered changed her behavior. And then she ended up having a 20 or 30 minute, really nice conversation with this lady that really enabled her to shift her behavior. So then we look at the third of the the weapons of mass communication, which is questions. Now, questions can be really something very, very powerful. I would say of all the things, if you were just to ask questions to people, for them to keep defining what they believe in, that would be an incredible, powerful thing to do. Excuse me. So good questions inform, great questions transform. So you can really, a question can really guide someone's, and obviously a bad question bombs. So the meaning of question really comes from Latin, where it has the meaning to seek, to look for, ask. And then we've got conquest, inquest, quest, question, request. So it's a very powerful concept. And, you know, I use this metaphor for a number of ways in the project, but I think shining light's very key, that if you were putting up a tent during the daytime, it would be very, well, it would be somewhat straightforward. But if you tried to put that tent up in the evening, it would like be impossible. So then, but what if we give you a torch? Suddenly you can see what's going on. So we use this in the project to describe a lot of the models that we use are really just torchlight. So you can see what's going on. Once you can see what's going on, everyone's intelligent enough to go, oh, well, I know that's not going to work. I'm not going to do that. But also a torchlight is like a question. You know, it really enables you to point somewhere and to shed light onto something. And the four powerful uses of questions is that we can obtain information. So we seek with a torch. So we can ask someone, we're literally pointing their focus, their consciousness to a certain place. We can bring things into an awareness. So that's to highlight it. We can impart information, you know, show them the light. We can capture attention. And this tends to be the most valuable commodity. So to bright light, bright light. So to really highlight something is very, very powerful. So then if we, again, come back to this, what is our most precious commodity, which is our attention, questions can really guide someone's attention. So, you know, the yellow box is our attention, and people say, oh, just follow the XXX. And then you might say, but would you still follow it if the policies cause more harm than good? Now that question, you know, that's a very, very powerful question. You have to be very careful when you use that question, because that can trigger cognitive dissonance very quickly. Because in fact, most people, you know, following the narrative are only doing so because someone in authority has told them to do so. If you then ask them that question, they're actually going to have to take more responsibility from themselves. So it's a very powerful question, but it's got to be used at the right time. Obviously, it's the gorilla. You can't unsee it. And then you could ask, is there something that doesn't make sense? So then what's going to come into their attention is the thing that doesn't make sense. So really think where the question takes attention. Now, if you spend just a little bit of time thinking about the questions that you ask, if you write them down and look at the answers, you'll realize which questions don't work and which questions can work. And there's some questions that we ask people that are just destined for failure. And one of the questions I like to ask is, have you heard of mind space? Oh, what's that? Well, there's this document that a bunch of psychologists have put together in how to control the public and influence them. Really? So straight away, we've gone down this, that's now in their awareness. They cannot unsee that gorilla. And hopefully if shared the right way, they might get a bit more curious. So in summary, stories reach deeply into us and transform us. They literally live by stories. So really choose the song we wish to dance to is very key. Metaphor allows us to digest our own information. It can form a secure communication channel. We've got one of the other metaphors we use is the hotel of knowledge. I've been on calls where we literally talk through this metaphor because they know what it means. And then we're saying, okay, well, how do we get people into the lobby? And obviously that video is on the website for those that are interested. Questions direct focus and obtain info. Where do you want to shine the light? If you get very good with questions, you can bring so much information into people's focus so quickly. So I was on one group today, and it was, you know, I think it's called Science for EU or something. These people, you know, and they posted up a meme saying, you know, oh yes, so someone's looked on YouTube and found something that all the top scientists missed. Typical, you know, thing that they want to hang on to. And then I posted, is it right to silence everyone? Because then surely all of the people that have the answers, we would never know. And then I said, that would be like, you know, if that was around in the 70s, we'd be living in asbestos houses, driving leaded petrol cars, and letting children smoke. So really just a question. And of course, it's a question that's not really going to get, I guess, much blowback, because what can you say to that? You can't say, no, we shouldn't ask questions. But really on the bit on the influence factors, and it's funny, don't be the mutton, be the lamb, is that when with the influence factors, which we've got lots of videos on, which a lot of them are being used against us. And the reason they work is because they're very powerful, but they're used in the wrong way because they pretend to be that thing. And what I mean is be the things that work. So if authority works, be an authority, know everything about that subject. If you don't, find someone that does. So what you'll find is that, the various media, they present people as authorities because they know people listen to authorities. And of course, we want to find the truth, which is the authority. So really on Andy, really the Gandhi quote is that Gandhi said, if you have truth, it has to be given with love. If it's not, both the message and the messenger will be discarded. And there's something in that when we're sharing things, if we come from sort of an angry or an aggressive tone, it really just gets rejected. It's a bit like giving someone a present. If you give it with an open compassion, that's much more likely to receive it. Now, just before we go into questions, there's one thing, it's really the answer is often outside the comfort zone. So we will always lean towards what we're used to. We lean towards the things that we're good at. Now, there was a funny thing that happened to me a couple of weeks ago. I went with a friend. We went for a drink in the evening, and it was at like a retirement club for Navy soldiers. And so there's a lot of retired Army personnel and stuff, and they had karaoke on there. And I'd never sung, I've done one song in my whole life. And a friend said, right, come on, let's go and sing. And like my instant thing was like, no. And I was like, hang on a minute. You go on calls with experts and scientists and doctors and you talk to them about complex things, but you don't want to get up in front of a couple of retired, sailors to sing a song. And I realized how silly that fear was. Like, oh, sorry. So I just went up there and sang a couple of songs, and it was really fun. And it's really getting over this, making mistakes or looking silly. And I think that's what stops so many of the solutions that we know are there. It's just realizing that it's okay, it's okay to make mistakes. It's okay to try new things. And really, we've got to keep getting out of those comfort zones. And I know probably most people here have spent a long time outside the comfort zones doing this. So what I'm going to do is open up for Q&A.